Я прекрасно знаю, что такое high school. У меня два моих сына, они прошли местную школу. И, понимаете, это полностью система, где из детей делают Homo digital, не Homo sapiens anymore. И это то, с чем мы, по благословению Божьему, родившиеся большинство из вас в России, имеющие русских родителей, когда я говорю русский, я не говорю, это единственная национальность, которая не имеет признаков по крови. Русский – это мировоззрение, это как бы единение состояния души, состояния духа. И поэтому, когда мы говорим «мы русские», мы благословенны Богом, потому что мы можем знать, что такое жить вместе с людьми разной национальности, разного даже вероисповедания, но иметь русский дух. И несколько лет назад я посчастливилась встретить одного священника, русского батюшку из Малоруссии. Он сказал такие интересные слова. В мире называют три вещи святыми. Святой город Иерусалим, город Господа нашего Иисуса Христа, святая гора Афон и Святая Русь. Это единственный кусок земли, который испокон веков называют святыми. И он сказал, что даже если люди не будут воевать, если они обленятся и положат копья, ангелы возьмут оружие и будут воевать за этот кусок земли. Потому что все войны были только с позиции защищать, и никогда не с позиции оборонять. И Маша вот тут сидит, она моя, мы с ней вместе учились в Ленинградском университете. И мы благословены тем, что у нас был удивительный учитель, один из многих учителей, Лев Николаевич Гумилев. Это сын, как вы знаете, Анны Ахматовой и Николая Гумилева. И нам посчастливилось быть на его лекциях. И потом мы проштудировали многие его книги. И сейчас многие говорят, да что там вспоминать, и пытаются сравнить Сталина и Гитлера, и идти в эти дебри. Но я хочу сказать, что вот фраза Льва Николаевича Гумилева, который отсидел 10 лет в ГУЛАГе и прошел штрафбат, и пытались очень многие либералы и русофобы как бы сказать ему: Лев Николаевич, они испоганили всю вашу жизнь. Он сказал: извините, но это не так. И он отвечал так: вы вводите понятие судьбы на самом деле, не понимая, что это такое. Судьба – это вероятность состояния, то есть существует процесс, который идет не жестко запрограммированно, а вариабельно. Причем вариабельность это зависит от такого количества фактов, что мы их даже учесть не можем, не то что совладать с ними. Поэтому и сейчас я охотно повторю, что доволен своей судьбой. Я был со своим народом и переживал то, что переживал мой народ. И когда эти безобразия кончились, я смог вернуться к себе домой, защитить диссертацию и получить то самое место, которое мог иметь 100 лет назад без всех этих треволнений. На кого мне обижаться? Он был очень верующим, православным человеком. И как эпиграф для Лениного разговора «Битва за Севастополь», я хочу почитать эпиграф, который Лев Николаевич Гумилев писал в своей книге «Всем нам завещана Россия». В наше время, когда мера грехов наших перешла через край, и страна наша находится в состоянии кризиса, только искренний подвиг нашего народа может смягчить промысел Божий и умолить Его даровать нам спасение от зла мира сего. Поэтому, пожалуйста, слушайте эту удивительную лекцию и помните, что мы русские. И мы должны помнить и знать свою историю и гордиться ей. Спасибо.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my fourth lecture on the Great Patriotic War. I've been very, very slow making these. Never enough time, never enough time. So today we will be talking about a very, very interesting moment, which will be the defense of Sevastopol. Sevastopol is a city in Crimea, which is a very big port, one of the most important cities in the Black Sea. And as you can see here it's written, the second chapter in the epic defense of the city port. Now that may sound strange because there was no first chapter, but I will explain why I wrote the second chapter as we go on. In the background, this is a pose stamp. It's commemorating a painting done by a Soviet artist which depicts the defense of Sevastopol. These are sailors that are fighting the Nazis. This is one of the most powerful and most enticing paintings done by artists of World War II. So, prelude to the battle. In the background you see an anti-aircraft gun manned by Soviet soldiers. I told you that I will explain why this is the second chapter. Why not the first? Well, 100 years, almost 100 years before 1941, there was another war called the Crimean War, in which the English, the French, and the Turkish tried to beat the Russian Empire away from Crimea. Crimea is a peninsula, which is very, very important in the world. Tensions over it happen almost in every single century that we know of humankind. So, 90 years before that, Sevastopol was a port that was the last point of defense of the Russian Empire troops. They stood their ground there for approximately 2 years. And even though they had to withdraw in the end, this was not called a retreat. It was not called a loss. It was called a withdrawal. And the British and the English and the Turkish were too weak to continue their attack into Russia, so that the Crimean War ended. Sevastopol was destroyed for the first time by enemy aggressors. 90 years later, we have a bit of a different situation. We have a Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, together with his allies, trying to conquer the world. And the Soviet Union is their next stop in their trip for worldwide domination. So, after the first 4 months of the Great Patriotic War, so the Great Patriotic War started on the 22nd of June 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans stood poised to strike at Moscow. So they planned to end this war in 4 months. The month was November. There were battles that happened not too far away from Moscow, approximately 15 kilometers away from Moscow. But Moscow was not the only area where there was a battle going on. Crimea was another region where there was very, very intense combat. So, a group of German forces had orders to take out the Soviet air bases and navy bases in Crimea. And the task was given to one of the best Nazi Germany's field commanders, Erich von Manstein. This is his picture over here. Manstein was so legendary that during the Nuremberg trials, he was acquitted. He was not charged with anything. Well, of course, by the Western side. The Soviet side said that he should be executed like the rest of the Nazis. But he was acquitted. Erich von Manstein. Yes. Manstein had a lot of battles that he's famous for, and he is called the genius of the German army, the genius of the high command of Hitler. You know, very, very important guy. So he is given the task to take out Crimea. Why Crimea? Well, first of all, Crimea can be called a natural air carrier. It is one of the few big, well, it's not exactly an island, it's a peninsula, but its position is very, very key. If you control Crimea, you have very, very big access to the Black Sea. And there was always combat for the Black Sea. The other landmass that can be compared to Crimea is Japan, which US President Ronald Reagan called the unsinkable air carrier of Western power. So Crimea it's an unsinkable air carrier too, but it's a tiny bit different. He was given the task of taking Crimea out. Another reason for taking out Crimea was because there were Soviet air bases in Crimea, which were constantly bombing Romania. Because, you know, Romania has access to the Black Sea, and Romania had a city named Ploiești. What was Ploiești? Ploiești was the main artery of fuel, gas, for the Nazi German army. And since the Soviets continued to bomb Ploiești, working there was impossible. The place was completely on fire. It was almost completely destroyed. And this meant that the German army couldn't continue their attacks. They couldn't continue their blitzkrieg. This could not be tolerated. So the order came to take them out. The Stavka is the general staff of the Red Army. It wasn't called the Soviet Army. It was called the Red Army. Understood that the forces that were in Crimea, they were not in a very good position. Because in case if they were surrounded, encircled, they could be destroyed pretty easily. But they also realized that Moscow had to be saved. So, the forces in there, the soldiers were given the order to stand and to defend Crimea from the Nazi Germans. Crimea, oh, by the way, Manstein, before he began his operation, he said, Crimea, and especially Sevastopol, is a very, very weak fortress. Taking out Crimea and Sevastopol will be even faster than taking out France. Well, Crimea was to become a bastion of glory and courage for yet another time in its history, and set the stage for another bloody battle. And over here is a map. It's very little, but I couldn't make it any bigger, sorry. It shows how the Germans advanced through Crimea. So they started at the top, so they started approximately from mainland Ukraine, and they went down. The whole operation was supposed to end in 2 months. Oh, I actually found a bigger version of the map, I didn't know, sorry. So on the left, that is a painting of the first defense of Sevastopol, which happened during the Crimean War, which I talked about. And the second picture over here is a picture of a Soviet ship being sunk by its own crew in Sevastopol during the second defense of Sevastopol. So, not very long before the Germans attacked Crimea, 20 years before that, during the Russian Civil War, the Red Army already had experience of combat in Crimea. The only difference was that the Red Army was the attacker. The White Army, which was the force, so if the Red Army were the communists, the Bolsheviks, who created the Soviet Union when they won the Russian Civil War, the White Army were the defenders of the monarchy. They wanted to bring back the old regime, the old times. Not all of them wanted a Tsar. Some of them wanted a president, some of them wanted a dictator, a republic, and they weren't very organized. That's why the communists won in the end. But, as I said, 20 years before 1941, the Red Army had experience of attacking Crimea, but not defending it. This led to a very big problem, because some of the White Army generals and officers who defended Crimea were on the Nazi German side. So they gave them advice on how to on where the possible defense placements could be done, where the defensive lines could be put, where the Red Army would defend. That made things a little harder. So they started their attack, and oh yes, so now I have to talk again about why Crimea is so important. Press it again. Sorry. So here, just for visual reference, we have a map of the Black Sea. Over here we have Turkey. Over here we have Ukraine. Over here we have Russia. Over here we have, I believe, Georgia. Here we have Romania, Bulgaria. Now, by the November of 1941, Bulgaria, Romania, and most of this territory were under German control. If they could take Crimea, that meant that they controlled this much of the entire territory of the Black Sea. And Turkey was more likely to become their ally. This was a big problem for the Nazi Germans. They had limited soldiers, limited resources. And Turkey wasn't too excited about joining the war and fighting on Nazi Germany's side. So they needed something that would make the Turkish go, oh, the Germans are winning. We should join the war on their side. so we can get more land for ourselves. Thankfully, this didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Oh, and here's just a map of the world. In blue, we have countries that were part of the Axis. So as you can see, usually when we talk about World War II and the Great Patriotic War, we only mention either the European theater, or very, very limitedly, we mention the African theater, if we're looking at this from a Western perspective. Well, as we can see, the Axis had allies all over the world, which meant there was combat not only in Africa and Europe, but in Asia too. Economic reasons. Crimea was needed because, well, number one, I explained that they would control the Black Sea. This would very, very help them bring their navy into the Black Sea, so they could destroy the Soviet Navy. They couldn't do that before because, well, the Turkish didn't let them do it. The Turkish said, you can't go through our straits, we're a neutral country. And it was also because they feared that the Soviet ships, which had bases in Crimea and in Russia and Georgia, would just simply go out and destroy them because there was their water. They knew the region very well. Morale reasons. As I said, they needed the Turkish to join the war. Another reason was that they really, really just needed to score victories. They understood that their war of lightning, blitzkrieg, could be won if they were unrelenting, if they were quick, if there were big victories everywhere. If there were big victories everywhere, then the enemy would be demoralized. The enemy would say, oh no, we've lost. We've lost this, and that. Thousands of our soldiers were killed. We'll have to surrender. That's what happened in France. Manstein, who I talked about, he was the guy that devised the plan for invading France. The plan was so successful that France, one of the most powerful countries in the world with one of the most powerful militaries, fell in 9 weeks. 9 weeks. So, as you can tell, Manstein was really, really, really smart, and he knew what he could count on, but not exactly. So, as I said, he wanted the battle to last only for 2 months. It lasted from October 30th, 1941 to the 4th of July, 1942. That's not 2 months. That's almost a year.
In Asia, besides Japan and Korea, who are other countries?
Oh,
Thailand and...
this is Burma, and this is territory of China. So, yes, because China had a civil war during that time. In the end, the communists won, as in the Russian Civil War. But before the communists won, there was a lot of different armies and factions. One of them was the Manchukuo, so the modern territory of Manchuria, I believe.
Sure.
They had a puppet state installed with the former Chinese emperor Hu Yi, who was kicked out by different forces 30 years before that. So, yeah, that territory also was part of the Axis of China. So, the first attack. Oh, over here, this is an image of the first days of defense, because as we all know, well, not as we all know, as many of us know, but when you attack in a war, you usually want to bomb everything. You usually want to destroy everything. So these are the results of the first German bombing, using airplanes, not artillery. They were too far from Sevastopol to use artillery. As you can see, everything is black, everything is fuming. It's not as bad as Stalingrad, though. When I do the presentation on Stalingrad, it will be much worse. Because during Stalingrad, after the first day of bombing, 80% of the city was destroyed. That's how bad the bombing was. Here, it was more like 20% of the city was destroyed. So, there was, as the first stage of the battle, there was a very, very intense month of combat. It was 30 days. It was called the Battle for Crimea. What was it all about? Well, it was all about winning time to build defensive lines around Sevastopol for the Soviet army. And it was all about destroying and encircling the Soviet army for the Germans. The Germans failed, even though they took a huge amount of territory. And as you can see, they set in blue as German territory. They separated the Red Army in two pieces. They failed because the majority of the Soviet army escaped either to over here or they got stranded over here. So they managed to withdraw the majority of forces. They were there was almost no encirclements done by the German forces at that time. So there were two main groups. One of them was over here. It was also known as the Crimean Front, Krimsky Front. and the other group was over here, near Sevastopol. On the 4th of November 1941, the Sevastopol defensive region was created because, you know, the Germans are next to the city. Sevastopol is a very big port. It is also a fortress. It was built initially as a fortress, so they have to defend the city. And that's why I said, that's 4th of November 1941, that's the date that everyone tells that the battle started from, because that was the day the Soviet forces got ready to fight. So, there was factories in Sevastopol which continued to produce munitions during the battle. This was also very important because usually when we have a city surrounded, it stops all work. It doesn't work, it becomes a battle zone. There's nothing that happens in the city. The civilians get evacuated, the soldiers do the fighting. Well, in Sevastopol, we had guns, artillery pieces, we had munitions being produced. So as soon as they were produced, they were sent to the front lines. Resources were very limited, but they still continued to make equipment for the Soviet soldiers. This was very good for the Soviet soldiers because imagine, you are in a battle, your gun stops working. But suddenly, after the battle ends, you get 2 more guns, so you could continue to fight. This was a very high morale booster. Oh, and this is Vice Admiral Oktyabrski. He was the person that was put in charge of the Sevastopol defensive region in 1941, and he commanded it for half a year. Then it was given over to another general. I couldn't find his picture, unfortunately. We'll talk about him later. But this man over here, he is one of the most legendary people of the Soviet Navy. After the war, he became the second in command of the Soviet Navy, so he was instrumental behind the rebuilding of the new ships and everything in the new Cold War. So from October 30th to November 21st, the German army tried to take Sevastopol unsuccessfully. What was their thinking? Their thinking was very simple. Alright, so for a month, we've been fighting these Soviet guys. We've beat them back, we've separated them into 2. This means that they should be weak. They shouldn't be prepared, right? Wrong. The Soviet forces were ready, and they beat the Germans back. So for almost a month, by the German army, I mean the 11th Army of Manstein, which consisted of 4 infantry divisions and I believe two tank divisions, or motorized divisions they were called differently, unsuccessfully tried to storm Sevastopol. So initially, the number of forces that were in Sevastopol for the Soviets was 20,000 people. That's not even an army, I believe, that's closer to 2 divisions. And with the arrival of another army, it became 50,000 people. Where did that army come from? Well, the answer is very simple. In Crimea, well actually near Crimea, there is another city called Odessa, which is almost a legendary city in our Soviet and Russian culture, and not only Russian culture, but I mean Soviet by former countries of the Soviet Union culture. A lot of anecdotes related to Odessa. There was a whole army called the Army Near the Sea, Primorskaya Army. The translation is kind of finicky and complicated. So it was 30,000 people who defended Odessa during the first 30 days and who withdrew on ships. Because the ships didn't have enough fuel, they landed 30,000 people in Sevastopol, and the defenders became now 50,000 people. Now that's much better. Now you have 5 divisions versus 6 divisions, more equal. So that was the first attack. The Germans were beat back, we were still in the city. The Germans weren't too scared because that was the first attack. If it didn't work the first time, we'll do it another time. And during this time, during the defense of Sevastopol, during the overall defense, there were multiple amphibious landings that were done by the Red Army. Now, you know how we all, here in Canada, we all hear about D-Day, the grand landing in Normandy, and how the American and the British and the Canadians and God knows who landed and tried to take France, and how on most of the beaches they got destroyed. Well, we were doing D-Days before the British and the Americans had even thought of them. And this is a picture of a ship firing towards the German forces, which are next to Sevastopol. Please. So there were 2 D-Days, 2 landings that were conducted. because the Soviet High Command, Stavka, understood that the defenders of Sevastopol had to be relieved. They needed help. If they weren't helped, well then, we would lose 50,000 people. And 50,000 people is a lot. So, the first one was the Yevpatoria assault. It was unsuccessful, the landing force was destroyed. It started on the 5th of January 1942 and ended on the 8th of January 1942. So that was 3 days. And those 3 days, 10,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. They landed in Yevpatoria trying to create another front, to open another region of battle, so that the Germans would not only leave their soldiers next to Sevastopol, but they would send some to another side. Unfortunately, due to the fact that the Stavka underestimated the Germans, they thought that in Yevpatoria, and next to Yevpatoria, the Germans had only one division. At that time, by coincidence, by accident, there were not one. There were 5 divisions next to Yevpatoria. They were conducting a raid against partisans. So they stopped for a second, killing partisans, and they switched to destroying the people who landed on the beach. So that was the first assault. It was unsuccessful. This is a picture. This is one of the very, very rare images of Soviet soldiers who landed in Yevpatoria and tried to fight. The second landing, there was a second one, it was much more successful, but it happened in a different area. It is also known as the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula. It was very, very successful. The landing went on to a new front being created. To be more exact, this is a map of the operation. In Russian it's called Kerchenska Feodosiyska Operatsiya. It started on the 26th of December 1941 and ended on the 2nd January of 1942. Now, why am I putting this, which happened earlier, than the first landing that I said, which happened later? Well, it's actually because there was very, very limited combat on this front, so in this area, before the second landing got destroyed. So technically, the battles that happened next to Kerch and Feodossia, they happened later. So this created a new front. So the Germans had to take more soldiers and withdraw them and fight on 2 fronts now. And on a 3rd front too, because there was very, very much partisan activity in Crimea that was happening. Even though Crimea doesn't have forests, the partisans still managed to hide in different places and to fight the Nazi invaders. So, later, the forces that were here, they were beat back. They were beat back approximately at the same time that Sevastopol fell, but we'll talk about the fall of Sevastopol later. So, what do we have? We have the landings, which helped to save the people in Sevastopol a little bit, to take the heat off of them. Our Soviet D-Days, essentially. So, the second attack. Oh, by the way, in the background, this is an image of Sevastopol's main square. The square of Lenin, because as you can see, there's the statue of Lenin. During the second attack. So this is 5 months after the initial attack. As you can see, the city is being more and more destroyed. The trees are done for. Multiple buildings are destroyed. Many of these buildings, if you can see in the background, they're very, very old buildings because Sevastopol is a very, very beautiful and very old city. So, now comes something that's very, very, very interesting. Some of you who were at the first presentation may remember that the Germans used extra heavy artillery to take Brest Fortress. For those of you who don't know, during the attack on the Brest Fortress, which lasted for a month, the Germans used everything that they could do to destroy the fortress. And one of these weapons was this big guy over here. This is the artillery cannon Karl, also known as Tor. Why was it called Karl or Tor? Well, this is a German weapon, and they love mythology a lot. Tor is one of the gods in Norse mythology. It is a very, very, very big cannon. Only one of these remains. It was captured by Soviet troops after the war. During the war, there were 12 produced, but only one survives to this day. But that wasn't the biggest one that was used. It wasn't that big compared to the very, very, very big weapon that was used. Behold, this is the Dora. What is the Dora, you may ask? The Dora sounds like a girl's name, something that's, not too scary. Well, this was the biggest weapon produced in history. It had a caliber of 800 millimeters. A gun that was 800 millimeters in the circle of the cannon. It had to be transported for 5 months. They couldn't transport it on the railroad. They had to deassemble it. So everything was taken apart like in Lego and transported in different parts. Every time this cannon fired, the sound could be heard over 50 kilometers away. That's how big this gun was and how powerful. And for comparison, this is a T-34-85 tank. It's a pretty average tank that was used by the Soviet Army. Now compared to the size of this is one of the shells, one of the explosive ammunition thingies that the Dora fired. I believe that this was a couple times taller than the average person. And the Dora fired not one, not two. It kept firing almost every day at Sevastopol and at different targets. Now, the problem is, because the shell is so heavy, and there's very, very little of them, the Dora fired only 2 times a day. One time in the morning, one time in the afternoon. So sometimes the Soviet soldiers would know what time of the day it is only when the Dora fired. Everyone could hear it around Sevastopol. So the Manstein requested the heaviest guns that they could get and the most of the artillery that they could get. Hitler, of course, was not happy because, what the heck are you doing, Manstein? You're supposed to be my best general, and you're taking away all the guns we have. This is just a little city. It's just Sevastopol. We lost at Moscow, and now you're asking for more guns. Manstein got his guns, and as he said in his memoirs, which I read, he said that that was probably the biggest amount of guns the Germans had any time during World War II in one region. Just the biggest. There was thousands of guns. Of course, we, the Soviet Army, had more guns later in the war. But during that time, the Germans got around, I believe, 3,000 guns around Sevastopol of different caliber. They were very, very big. So, the second attack said that Sevastopol will be taken in a week. Maybe we'll give them two or 3 extra days because the Soviet Army fights very strong. So on December 17th, after the initial attack date was postponed because of partisan activity, as strange as it is, partisans, there's not that many of them, but they do a lot of stuff. And also due to climate conditions, because, fortunately for us, for the Soviets, and unfortunately for the Germans, the weather that year was horrible. Not only in Crimea, but next to Moscow too, and next to Leningrad. It was one of the coldest winters recorded ever in the world. Temperatures next to Moscow and Leningrad were negative 40 degrees Celsius. So in Crimea, which is much warmer, you can imagine how bad it got. So, again, they were thrown back to their initial positions, even though they had all these guns and they had a ratio of 3 to 1. So there were 50,000 defenders in the city. The Germans had 150,000 soldiers, just soldiers. We're not counting the tanks or the guns or the airplanes. Tried to storm the city, they failed. Why? Well, because number one, the Red Army was very, very strong in their combat spirit. And number two, because the Germans delayed the assault for a month, that gave us an extra month to build the defensive lines even better. We knew where the Germans would attack because we had spies, we had intelligence in the German high command. And also because we had one of the most interesting weapons of World War II. We had the Ni-1 tanks. Ni stands for Naispuch, which means to scare, which is a very weird name for a tank, you might say. Well, you see, the tank, which is actually a picture of this tank over here, it was made from tractors. Tractors that were in Sevastopol. They got extra armor around them, and they got little 76mm guns. And they were used against the Germans because those were the only tanks the Red Army had in Sevastopol. They were very, very successful. The German army feared them. Number one, because they didn't understand what the heck this thing is. And number two, because these tanks were never used against other tanks. They were only used against infantry. The armor was too thin. So, as you can see, big guns get defeated by a tractor. Aviation. Now this is another interesting part of Sevastopol. There was very, very limited combat in the sea. Even though you know that Sevastopol is a port. There's the Black Sea right next to it. We should have huge battles happen. No, there were no battles. The main battles were in the air. And on the ground, of course, but the air is very, very interesting. Now, in Soviet literature, and in German literature for some reason, military literature, the air combat over Sevastopol is rarely mentioned. Well, we know why it's rarely mentioned from the Soviet side, because the main thing was that the Soviets were withdrawing constantly. There wasn't very big battles between the Soviet and the German Air Force. The Soviets were just trying to win time to withdraw their airplanes. But the Germans, I don't know why they don't write about it. This was their air. This is one of the few areas during World War II where they did whatever they wanted. By the way, this is a picture of German Stuka bombers. These are the most deadly German bombers. They were very old when World War II started. They were produced, I believe, 10 years before the war. But because they were so slow and so accurate, and because they had this siren. So every time they would start their dive bomb, they were dive bombers, so when they would drop their bombs, they would dive like this. They had a siren, so every time the bomber would go down at the target, it would go yee, and the sound was very, very, very loud. Even the German soldiers were scared of it. I read the memoirs of a German soldier. He said, every time we heard that sound, we knew we had air support. And a Soviet soldier wrote that every time I heard that sound, I thought the demons had taken the sky and I kicked the angels out of it. So, we have the Soviet aviation withdrawing constantly. The planes are just flying away. No planes being left behind. And the Germans flying all around. Does this mean that the Germans don't get shot down and they get to do whatever they want? No, they don't. Why? Well, because we have another ingenious Soviet invention. We have this floating artillery battery, which has guns installed in it. It is the most legendary anti-aircraft unit of World War II. It was called "Не трогай меня," which means "don't touch me." As funny as it is, this little thing over here that the Germans thought was useless, it shot down 22 airplanes in 9 months. 22. And the most interesting thing for the Germans was, if this thing is floating on water, how can it be so accurate? The secret? There is no secret. The Soviets we just had very, very good people on that battery. So I believe that this battery was preserved. I'm not sure where it exactly is in Sevastopol, but it was preserved. And I think that there was initiative from the Soviet command to give it the Order of Lenin, which was one of the highest decorations. So don't touch me. The message was very clear. So the Nazi aircraft were being shot down by anti-aircraft guns, but there were no Soviet fighters in the sky. One of the best German aces in World War II, Hans Ulrich Rudel, he scored 50 victories. By 50 victories, this is tanks, trucks, ships that he destroyed in Crimea, next to Sevastopol. Then again, while destroying those 50 ships, he lost a leg, and he was shot down 23 times. So, not exactly the best fight. Now, the last attack. As you can see, I did an image that is almost exactly the same to the image that I showed you during the second attack. The thing is, I found this very interesting, that the person who took the picture, he did it during 2 different times, but he found the exact same position. And as you can see, just a tiny bit. There's a bit more destruction going on in the background, and the top over here is destroyed. So this is a picture during the 3rd assault. As you can see, the statue of Lenin is perfectly fine, but everything else is being destroyed. Anyway. This is where the funny thing is. This is where the presentation started glitching out. I had to install the special appearing effects for each item, not for all items. So, the last attack. The Germans amassed even more artillery than they could. Manstein wasn't allowed to command the operation. He was fired. He wasn't really fired. They told him, stay away. They got another German general, another legendary guy, Kurt von Tippelskirch. He was the most legendary tank commander of the Germans in World War II, and he said, well, Manstein, I'm going to get even more guns, even more people, and even more airplanes to take the city. And he did. Why? How could he manage to take the city? Well, it is very simple. If before the German soldiers were instructed to preserve themselves, so they were said, don't be too hard, we need you. This time they were said, you have to take the city. You have to take the city. They even took away the food the German soldiers had, and the alcohol that they usually carried with themselves. And they said that you will eat only when you take Sevastopol. Now, when the Germans started their third attack on the city, they had very, very, very heavy casualties. Some of the units that were attacking were reduced to 25%, so they had 75% killed, destroyed. And most of the other German units had casualties between 40 and 50%. Usually, when a unit has 50% casualties, it is withdrawn. It is considered a unit that has been nearly destroyed. It needs to regroup, it needs more time. If there's 75% casualties, the unit is immediately withdrawn and disbanded. A new unit is created based off of it because it can't fight anymore. If we say we have a division which has 10,000 people, we have 75% of that division killed. It's not really a division anymore. It's a regiment. It's gotten much smaller. But the Germans didn't care because they wanted food. They wanted their wine. And most importantly, they wanted Sevastopol to be taken. So they continued pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. And finally, on the 7th of June, 1942, there was a tiny, tiny breakthrough that occurred at the southern flank. It occurred over here. This is Sapungara, one of the main locations in Sevastopol. It's not exactly a mountain. It's more like a hill, but it's called a mountain because why not? And they had managed to just take what is around the hill. And even though they didn't take much, they got extra elevation. So they moved all their guns and they started firing at the city. Because if before the city was much higher than the people who were attacking them, now they were more on the same level. They could destroy the targets more easily. And then, 10 days later, on the 17th of June, they finally broke through at the northern flank, so south, north, they broke through the northern flank, and they cut off the people who defended the north part of the city and the south part of the city. Here's just an image of Soviet sailors fighting in the city. Oh, by the way, the Germans called the Soviet sailors Black Death, Черная смерть, because the sailors, they weren't infantry soldiers, they were sailors. They fought with such courage, and they were so powerful, that as soon as the Germans saw them, they would run away, and they would call on the artillery to fire the soldiers. They wouldn't go into one-to-one combat. They were called Black Death because of their uniforms. They knew that if you were to fight with the Soviet sailors, you are dead. Many of the German soldiers who fought against the sailors developed PTSD, so, post-traumatic stress disorder, because these guys were something that was completely different. They were true heroes. If the soldiers were hard enough, these guys were just impossible, unbelievable. So, now, as I said, the third attack succeeded. The defenders were split. The city was going to be taken. And now rises the question, what do we do? We have 50,000, well, not 50,000, now it's more like 30,000. We have 30,000 people in the city, people who are soldiers. Most of the civilian population had withdrawn. The factories had stopped working by that time. We have soldiers. How do we save them? Most of the ships that we have in the Black Sea can't swim anymore because they have no ports. How do we save them? It's almost impossible. So the decision, a very, very hard decision was taken to save only the commanders and the commissars. Very, very unfortunately. So, but if you think that the generals and the commissars got a very good ride home, they didn't. Most of them had to evacuate via U-boat, so via submarine, and many of those submarines were sunk. And many, many of these commanders, they didn't leave. Many of them committed suicide. Or many of them tried to commit suicide on the way home because they couldn't believe that they were leaving these people behind to their death. So eventually, when the generals and some of the generals and commanders stayed because they wanted to die together with their battle. So they defied their orders. They said, no, we're not going to do this. The last soldiers got together into two groups and they continued to fight until the Germans did I believe they did 1 week of very, very intense bombing and 1 week of very, very intense artillery fire. And they also used flamethrowers. After that 1 week, everyone surrendered. Whoever could escape to the partisans ran away to the partisans. Whoever couldn't, surrendered. So we have 30,000 Soviet soldiers who had to surrender to the Nazis. Is there results that we have to remember? Well, even though 30,000 people were taken prisoner, a very, very big amount of Nazi troops was held off. The Germans had to send their best generals, especially Manstein, who actually became field marshal after Sevastopol fell, even though he had nothing to do with the final taking of Sevastopol. And these guys could have been used at another point. The troops that were there could have been used in other places. And now, even though Sevastopol fell, the partisans became much more powerful. They had more soldiers, they had more men who were willing to fight. So, the German troops there had to fight the partisans now, which was worse, because if there's actual units, actual soldiers that you know would fight, you see them, you can maybe know how they'll fight. Partisans disappear. Very, very little groups. They do everything usually at night or day. They are unseen, and killing them is almost impossible. Oh yes, this is an image of another very legendary points of defense. This is the artillery. I can't remember the direct.
34?
Pardon?
34?
Yes, it's artillery fort. Thank you. It's artillery fort number 35. This is the fort that the Germans absolutely and totally despised. As strange as it is, they called the fort, I believe, they called it Stalin. Even though our name wasn't Stalin, it was just number 35. They called it Stalin because of how much they hated this fort. This fort continued firing until the last day of the evacuation of the battle. Other forts would give up their weapons to give them to the number 35 because it was so psychologically hated by the Germans. You know, the Germans might go, oh, we defeated another fort, but that damn Stalin is still firing. It would decrease morale. And here's another image of people, of civilians being evacuated from Sevastopol. This is an image taken, I believe, in March of 1942. This is the last group of civilians that were taken away, and the factory stopped working after that. As you can see, this is, maybe you can see the picture's a bit too small. There's almost no chaos happening, which is quite interesting. And most of the people who you see withdrawing are women and children. There's no men, even older. So, and during the siege of Sevastopol, the Orthodox Church had a very, very important role too. They served services, they did sermons every day. Every day they would go out to the soldiers and they would support them. They would bless them in God's name so they could continue to fight and continue to defend Sevastopol. And the background is, this is the oldest building in Sevastopol. It was built in 1822. This building is called the Church of All Saints. It survived both of the battles of Sevastopol. So it survived the Crimean War, when the city was destroyed completely, and it destroyed the second time, so in 1942, when the city was again destroyed completely. one of the very, very few buildings that survived both attacks, and it was a church. There's actually two more buildings, which are churches too, which coincidentally survived both bombings too. So, yeah, over here. So we have, the other two are the Church of the Saint Apostles Peter and Pavel, and the Church of the 12 Apostles. So this is the Church of the 12 Apostles. It is done in more of a Greek style because one of the first mayors of Sevastopol, an admiral, he really, really loved ancient Greek culture. So he said, let's build something that looks like the ancient Greek columns and everything. Again, this is one of the buildings that survived both the Crimean War and the Battle of Sevastopol. And this is the Church of Saint Apostles Peter and Pavel. It survived both battles too. And not for a single day did the bells stop tolling, stop ringing. Not for a single day did the priests stop conducting their services. They kept the soldiers morally, continued to fight, they blessed them. And a very, very important event happened 2 years ago. On the Kamchatskaya Lunet, it was one of the places where, in both battles, in the Crimean War and in the Siege of Sevastopol in 1942, there was very, very intense combat. The Russian Orthodox Church is building a new church there, on the place of the battle. It is built in the honor of Saint Guri, the Krishna of Taurida. So he is one of the first Orthodox priests that came to Crimea and who, well, spread Orthodox Christianity, spread religion amongst the people who lived in Crimea. They were mostly Mongols, so they weren't Orthodox Christians. Yes, it is built out of wood, which is very, very interesting. I don't know why, but it's built out of wood. It's a symbol. We will be back. Here is an image of when the Soviet troops came back to liberate Sevastopol and to liberate Crimea. This happened 1 year after Sevastopol was left. And, yes.
So much.
It never works. It never works correctly. It never works fine. Technology. So, many of the soldiers who fought in Crimea, not the ones that were at Sevastopol, the ones at Sevastopol were mostly taken prisoners. And so they went to German concentration camps, or they didn't have a happy fate. The other ones that were on the other side, next to Kerch and Feodosia, they came back to fight 1 year later and to liberate Crimea. And they took it back in 35 days, which I think is outstanding, because if the Germans had to take Crimea in 8 months, our troops took it back in 35 days. Although the Germans were prepared, they were waiting for the attack, and they realized that they needed Crimea very, very much. Why did they need Crimea? Well, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as I said before, and if Crimea was taken, then the other countries of the Axis would go, oh no, something is happening. They're losing more and more territory, and this is not good. This is not good. Maybe we should leave the Axis and join the Allies, which is a thing that happened at the end of the war. Bulgaria, Romania, months before the war ended, they switched. So instead of being the Axis, they became the Allies. Which is why we didn't have I don't think we had any Bulgarian or Romanian prisoners that were at the Nuremberg trials. We only had the Germans. Anyway, so Odessa was taken back 3 years after it was left by the Soviet soldiers. Why am I talking about Odessa again? Well, because in 1941, during the first 30 days, which I talked about, the very intensive battle for Crimea, the Soviet soldiers who left Odessa cried when they were leaving. And they left pamphlets which said, we will be back. Odessa, wait for us and we will come back. And almost all of those soldiers who left Odessa in 1941 survived to 1944, actually 1943, and came back to liberate it. So now we can compare a tiny bit the casualties on both sides. if the Germans, when they were defending Crimea, they lost 140,000 soldiers, we lost 90,000 soldiers. And you know, I think this is one of the battles that could debunk the myth that the Soviets always had higher casualties. That myth itself was made by the Germans themselves, because during the Cold War, the Soviets had very, very limited access to Western news sources, so the Germans would go, we were the best, we were the smartest, and of course the Western allies were the best, the Soviets were stupid. So as a result, there was a very, very popular myth that every time the Soviets thought they were very stupid, they always suffered higher casualties, and they won only because they had more tanks, guns, and ships and soldiers. Maybe the last part, that we had more of everything, is true, but that's the fault of the Germans for not having more weapons and equipment and soldiers that we did. They shouldn't have fought against us. They shouldn't have started trying to conquer the world in the first place. And this is Malachov Kurgan. This is a hill. It's more like a hill, a Malachov. It's very, very, very legendary, because during the first siege of Sevastopol, during the Crimean War, this was the place of the most intense combat, specifically the fourth section of this hill. The fourth section of this hill, it is now a museum. I think they're trying to recreate the atmosphere that was back in 1855 and 1854, I'm not sure. But to show you how intense it is, each of the three commanders that commanded the Russian army during the Crimean War died on the fourth bastion. So the first admiral, who was the commander in charge, died in the fourth bastion. The second admiral, who was in charge, died in the fourth bastion. And the last one died in the fourth bastion. That's how intense the combat was. That's how legendary it was. And during the second siege of Sevastopol, it was very, very intense too. It was very important. Why? Well, because when the Germans took this hill, they had the possibility to shoot it anywhere in the city. It's a quite elevated place. So if you have even more elevation in the city itself, you can just shoot at anything. But we took back Crimea, we took back Sevastopol in years. So this is a map of how we took back Crimea. Well, this map is better than the German one that I showed you before. But as you can see, we used almost the same exact strategy the Germans used. Only, you know, we just moved the arrows to the left and right a little bit. But we did it in 35 days, not in 8 months. We liberated everything. It's amazing. And, oh, by the way, this is the other thing that was the difference. We also had troops over here in Kerch and Feodosia, so it was an attack from two sides. For us, and not like for the Germans from one side. So the lessons of Sevastopol. There's no text over here because I couldn't find any words to describe the lessons. I'll try to say them like this. Oh, this is an image of Sevastopol around October 1941. It shows you how there's trucks, the quality is horrendous, sorry. We have soldiers and we have trucks going to the front line. We have trains over there. I wanted to say that Sevastopol is truly a unique city. It is a port, it is a fortress that it has been destroyed at least 2 times in its existence. And every time it has been destroyed, it becomes even more beautiful. If India was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire, then I think we can consider Sevastopol the crown jewel of Crimea. I think that would be a very fitting description of Sevastopol. The city is very, very beautiful. And every time I look back at Sevastopol, I think, if the first time there was less people on our side and we still gave a great fight, the second time we had even less soldiers and we were cut off from all of the Soviet Union and we still gave a good fight. Does this show something? Does this show that we just were almost unbeatable? I think that the Soviet people, and by Soviet people I mean everyone who was in the 15 republics before the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we just have a spirit, a unique spirit that lets us live, lets us persevere. No other Western nation has that spirit to fight for their cause. And usually that cause is right. It's not always right because it depends on your point of view, but I think it's just we had the highest morale and we had the highest capabilities. If we didn't have guns, we would use our hands. If our hands failed, we would use our legs. If we didn't have legs, we would use our teeth. That's true too. There's a very interesting story. When there was the blockade of Leningrad, there was a little girl. And her father was killed in the combat and her mother starved to death. And so she was cared after by other people. And every time they would come to her, they would ask her, if the Germans come to the city, what will you do? How will you fight? At first she was strong, so this happened over the course of many days. At first she was strong, she would say, oh, I'll take a gun and I'll shoot the Germans. The second time, there were no guns. The people were starting to starve more and more. She would say, well, I'll use my hands. The third time when they came, she was in her bed. She was starving, she didn't have enough food to eat, and they asked her, if the Germans came, what would you do? And she showed her teeth. She couldn't talk, but they understood that if the Germans came to Leningrad, she would try to rip their throats. The girl survived the blockade. I think she got evacuated and she went to another city. But I think this shows the kind of fighting spirit that we have, that we're all capable of. So I thought very, very hard about how can I make this presentation even more interesting, because the previous one was not exactly the lightest one. So I found a very, very interesting and unique song about Sevastopol. To people who speak Russian and who lived in the former Soviet Union, I'll say the name of the song in Russian, Sevastopolski Vals. So the Waltz of Sevastopol for the English speakers. It is a song that was written in 1955, during the time when Sevastopol was being rebuilt, and it talks about a sailor who remembers Sevastopol and who talks about how beautiful it is. If you will let me, I will play one chorus, and if you would like to, and if you know the song, please sing along. Just a second.
Севастопольский вальс, золотые деньги, там светили в пути не раз далекие маяки. Севастопольский вальс, помнят все моряки. Разве можно забыть мне вас, золотые деньги?
Well, sorry, that'll be enough for the music. Now just some pictures of Sevastopol. This is, sorry for a second. So this is a very interesting monument. This is the monument to the fallen ships. It was built after the Crimean War to commemorate some of the ships that were sunk to defend Sevastopol. So these were old ships used by the Russian Navy, and they were sunk so that the British could not use their ships, because if they tried to use their ships, then the ships that sunk at the bottom would destroy their hulls. They would make the other ships sink. This monument has survived for 200 years. Well, almost for 200. Well, more like 100 and something years, but nothing has touched it. Not a single war, not a single battle. After the war, some of the cities were given the title of city hero, because to commemorate the intense combat that happened around the city, that they were true heroes. And Sevastopol got that honor. It is, as you can see over here, this is Sevastopol written in Russian. This is it is a copy of the hero of the Soviet Union order. So this is just to show that Sevastopol is a true city hero. I believe only 18 cities got that honor, and Sevastopol is one of them. Here is it's a statue to commemorate the fighting that happened in Sevastopol. At the front we have a sailor, and over here we have a soldier. So this is to show that both the sailors and the soldiers fought to defend Sevastopol. They're facing the sea, to show that they just kept fighting, and that they will keep Sevastopol safe for years and years to come, for centuries, because they're looking at the sea to see the enemy invaders that might come. Over here is another commemoration to the defenders of Sevastopol. It says, "To the defenders of Sevastopol who walked towards immortality, who stepped into immortality." Now, by immortality we mean that they...
Вот эти люди, это гиганты, у которых мышцы, кожа, кости. Они есть хотели и пить. Они защитили нас, наших детей, внуков. Вечная им слава. Спасибо.
Еще на пару минут займу вас всех. В качестве рекламы, если кто-то соберется посетить Севастополь, сам по себе, естественно, очень замечательный, красивый город. Вот мы в прошлом году были с семьей там. И вот очень рекомендую, и нам тоже рекомендую посетить 35-ю батарею. Она как-то там на окраине, на мысе каком-то находится, на окраине Севастополя. Мы туда поехали, нам все очень рекомендовали. Мы единственное делали ошибку. То есть посещение ее бесплатно, но надо резервировать билет по интернету. И летом там уйма просто народу, там за несколько недель надо регистрировать заранее. То есть мы приехали, походили по самому комплексу сверху, очень интересно там, но там самая интересная часть внутри, куда уже по билетам пускают, там под землей вводят все эти казематы и так далее. Вот, то есть вот у нас тоже план когда-то попасть, опять посетить все-таки полностью. Ну и там мало того, что вот эта военно-историческая часть интересная, там рядом мыс, там можно потом пойти пешочком покупаться. Очень симпатичное место.
Спасибо большое.